And gentlemen, it is a delight to introduce this evening's program. I'm Jonathan Crane. I'm a professor of bioethics and Jewish thought here at the Center for Ethics at Emory University, and it's a delight to open up tonight's conversation. It is fairly common for luminaries to come to our campus to speak at us on some topic or another. It is rare, however, it is the rare leader who comes to engage in meaningful conversation, to explore with us multiple perspectives on complicated topics that deeply impact our lives individually and collectively. Tonight, we are privileged to have with us 4 individuals who want to do just that, converse with us about tough choices we make every single day. This evening's conversation will not solve any problem, I want to forewarn you, nor will we conclude some hidden or explicit agenda. Rather, tonight fits into a larger conversation that we here at Emory are having about the nature of food, what eating means, and how we can feed civilization without harming ourselves, the environment, laborers, businesses, and more. Tonight feeds into, and that pun is intended, the Emerging Food Studies and Ethics program that we are building here at Emory University. There's much I can say about the Food Studies and Ethics program, so if you'd like to learn more about it, please reach out to me after tonight. In the meantime, we are thankful to the Goizueta Business School, Whole Foods Market, Venturing and Emerging Brands, Emory's Office of Sustainability, and Emory's Center for Ethics for their generous support of tonight's program. Tonight's event would not be happening were it not for the diligence and professionalism of these amazing colleagues of mine at the Center for Ethics, Jennifer, Allison, and Paige, among others. Thanks are also extended to Evening in John's office and Toby in Bruce's office for their coordinating efforts. Thanks too to Food Founders, the undergraduate student group led by Isaac Goldman and Shivam Jariwala, who are helping with logistics for tonight. Before we begin, however, please make sure that your cell phones or any other buzzing technology that might be in, on, near, or around you, that they are turned to silent. As you do, please make sure that you text all of your friends. The bit.ly Eats Live website up there, because we are live streaming this right now. I have the privilege now to invite my friend and colleague, Dr. Wayne Silverman, Director of Development at the Center for Ethics, to welcome and introduce John Mackey, who will give a few opening remarks.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to introduce John. 40 years ago this spring, a mutual friend connected us for the purpose of playing cards and disc golf, like Frisbee golf. This was 1978. John had just opened a very cool store called Safer Way. The grocery was on the main floor, and there was a restaurant on the second floor. I've never had a better salad bar since then. It was an amazing salad bar. 2 years later, with some other friends, they merged Safer Way and another store for the first Whole Foods Market that was on Lamar. There were a small handful of natural and organic full-service grocery stores in the country, but what John and his friends did was to create a new model that really didn't exist heretofore. What they did was to radically change the world. They changed how we eat, how we shop, how we grow, and how we harvest food. It immediately became a focal point for many of us in Austin. We recognized that something different was happening. Then in May of 1981, Central Texas had one of those short-duration, high-intensity rainfalls. I didn't go to the card game that night at David Mathis's house where John was. I was at Mother's Cafe at a party, but I had taken a geohazards course at UT, and I knew about Shoal Creek. I knew that Shoal Creek was one of the flashiest creeks in Central Texas, and that something was going to happen. And it did. 17 people were killed, and all the businesses in the lower part of Lamar were flooded. They had water up to the ceilings, including the first Whole Foods Market store. Their devoted team members rushed to the store, and many community members came together to rebuild it. For the remaining years that that store was there, you could walk into the store, and up on the ceiling there was a high water mark of where the water ended up. And also there were sandbags in the front of the store for any future floods. They stored some sandbags there. John took that vision of how a world could relate to food and eating, and he kept it growing. He and his colleagues created the Declaration of Interdependence. That's guided the company since the 80s. His team structure created employees that were dedicated to that vision. And to this day, when you go into a Whole Foods store and you ask someone, where can I find something? What do? Do they tell you where it is? They walk you exactly to where the item is. Throughout the years, John and my lives have intersected. We continued playing disc golf when we could, even though he plays very infrequently. When we played 2 weeks ago, his focus was totally there, and his game was better than ever, and mine, not so good. I could mention that Whole Foods has 475 stores and $17 billion in revenue and 50,000 team members. It's still alive and growing. In fact, there'll be a 365 store in Decatur, probably later this year, and it's growing under his leadership. However, I'm not sure that you're aware that along the way, he took those values and ethics and created other structures as well. The Whole Planet Foundation provides microloans to women around the world to help them create their own businesses. The Whole Kids Foundation is devoted to improving children's nutrition and wellness and ending childhood obesity. As co-founder of Conscious Capitalism, he outlined a new way of running businesses that are socially responsible, and now there are Conscious Capitalism chapters around the world, including a new one in Atlanta. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Jag. And thanks, Chris, for leading it. Where are you, Chris? There you are. In fact, one of the Center for Ethics board members is Ben Chestnut, the founder of MailChimp, which in December was ranked the top company in 2017 by Inc. And he told me that he based his business model on the tenets of conscious capitalism, and he owes John a great debt. John is a consummate reader and a consummate thinker. It's ironic that the last transformation now, or that the latest, I should say, transformation now of Whole Foods Market has a book connection. I don't know what that is, but there's some book connection to the latest. Even now, John is able to continue to have the company reflect his values as a new way of thinking about food, eating, and shopping is unfolding. So through 4 decades that I've known John, he has always been radically alive in everything he does. And it's my honor to present my friend and disc golf buddy, John.
Well, first let me thank Wayne. Wayne makes me look as good today. Thanks to Jonathan, he's very persistent. Oh, I'm supposed to do that. Better? Better? Okay, good.
Repeat all the stuff about Wayne.
Wayne was a really bad disc golf player. So he finally moved to Atlanta so he wouldn't keep getting kicked, his ass kicked every weekend. No, thanks to Jonathan and Wayne in particular, they're very persistent in getting me and my debate partner Bruce to come down here and do this tonight. So there were a few, and also for Paul, had a very nice chat with him today. Very wise and learned man. I hope we get a chance to do it again sometime. So I'm not trying to start the debate early, but I just thought I would deal with some of the frequent questions that come up. The most frequent one oftentimes in debate, so I hope I'm taking this point off the table, is like, okay, so you're this vegan. I've been a vegan for 15 years. I'm vegetarian long before that, very committed to animal welfare. Then how come Whole Foods Market sells meat? You're such a hypocrite. And like they're making some kind of debate points there. So I thought I'd take this one off the table. So remember Wayne was talking about Safer Way. Well, Safer Way, I was vegetarian when he opened up Safer Way. Safer Way was a vegetarian store. We didn't sell any dead animals whatsoever. We didn't sell sugar. We didn't sell white flour. We didn't sell coffee. We didn't sell alcohol. We were like super pure. We also did almost no business. We lost half of we had $45,000 in capital. We lost half of it in the first year. And my girlfriend who co-founded it with me, we lived in the store. We lived on the 3rd floor of the store. We took our showers in the Hobart dishwasher. So I'm pretty sure that violated health code, even in a hippie town like Austin. And we scratched out a small profit the next year before we opened the first Whole Foods Market, where we combined with another store and merged with them. And what I realized is no matter how idealistic you may be, when you're in business, you have to meet the marketplace where you find it. And that's what Whole Foods has done. We've taken it as far as we can go, at least at that, what the consciousness of people was. And that's been a great platform, because one of the points of conscious capitalism is that business can be this tremendous force for good in the world. In fact, business can do far more good than nonprofit organizations or governmental entities. For-profit business is the greatest value creator in the world, and it's nothing close to it. And yet, it's frequently misunderstood. It's usually stained that it's all about money and greed and selfishness and exploitation. Business people are routinely castigated as fundamentally evil people. I mean, statistics show that like in TVs and murders, just start paying attention when you watch who murders who. 90% of those murders you'll find out are business people. In reality, we actually commit less than 1% of all the murders. We hire other people to do it for us. No, seriously. So business can be this tremendous force for good, and I've always seen that was part of what Whole Foods' higher purpose is. I co-authored a book called Conscious Capitalism. We talk quite a bit about that. If I hope that some of you will look through that or buy that and read it someday. And what we've tried to do in a sense, what Whole Foods is trying to do for animals, we've probably done more to lessen animal suffering, certainly more than any other food store in the history of the world. We co-founded a global animal partnership where we do our rating for how the animals are treated. So you can get a rating from, well, even to get into our stores, you have to get at least a rating of 1, which is far better than typical factory farm production that you get in most supermarkets. And then it goes all the way up to 5+. And we've done tremendous amount to lessen that animal suffering. We've also tried to be very plant food focused at Whole Foods. We've done a lot to promote plant food eating. I personally done a lot. I wrote a book called The Whole Foods Diet. I saw it out there. I don't know if they're charging you for it, but if they're not, you should definitely pick one up.
Steal this book.
Steal this book, exactly. And skip to chapter 13, because there I lay out the ethical case for not consuming animals at all. In the book, we argue that from a health standpoint, and it's what I'll argue tonight, somewhere between 0% and 10% probably is consistent with good health. Once you get below 10%, as you will see when I get up here and I start showing the statistics, it doesn't look good for eating animals. In any case, I'm honored to be here tonight. I'm looking forward to the debate, and thanks for coming out. It's a good turnout here, and let the fun begin.
Thank you very much, John. A few words on how tonight will proceed. Tonight's discussion takes the form of a sort of a debate. The participants will speak about the following proposition. There it is. The proposition, eating meat is ethical and healthy. Two will take the pro side, supporting this claim, while the other two will present arguments against this claim. Each speaker has approximately 12 minutes to make initial arguments. During these preliminaries, the audience is invited to compose questions on the 3x5 cards that you received when you walked in. Please put your names on these cards and the questions that you would like to ask. We will collect these cards after the preliminary round and select a few for our concluding section this evening. Each team will then have a few minutes to offer rebuttals to the arguments they just heard. And to wrap up the evening, we will invite you to articulate your questions to the speakers, the ones that have been selected. We have too many people here to invite all people to engage in the Q&A. So it's my pleasure right now to briefly present our speakers. On the pro side, we have two adventurous undergraduates, Mackenzie and Isaac. Both are majoring in food studies through the Interdisciplinary Studies Department, drawing from such disciplines as sustainability, anthropology, nutrition, law, business, ethics, and more. Isaac and Mackenzie are also members of the team who won a global case study competition at the 2017 European Association for Agricultural Economists that addressed community-supported agriculture and farmers markets. Their interlocutors on the con side are Bruce Friedrich and John Mackey. Both are founders of organizations that innovate in the food space. Each has labored to transform how Americans feed themselves and what food can and should be. Each has published broadly, spoken globally, and is widely recognized as a leader in their respected industries. While much more can and perhaps should be said about each of these speakers, let it just be said we thank you tonight for sharing your thoughts and views with us in this provocative yet complicated question. Those are the sides. So, without further ado, I would like to invite up Isaac. I'm sorry? No, we just need to. Bring it.
Okay, just by show of hands, who here has eaten meat this week? Raise your hand. There we go. That's a good number. Now, who here hasn't eaten meat this week? Okay. Interesting. So for those people who have eaten meat this week, I'm here today to reassure you that you can live a very ethical life and a very healthy life. And here's how we're going to go about doing that. So first, we're going to start out with the role that meat played in the evolution of humans, right? How it allowed us to develop over time. Then we're going to launch into sustainable agriculture methods, such as silvopasture, which is a great way that we can move forward producing the sustainable type of meat. So where does this start? So let me tell you a story about human evolution. It's a story that is continuing to this day, and it's a story that started millions of years ago. And it actually, we started incorporating meat into our diet 2.6 million years ago. It's very precise. And so what that allowed us to do was to eat this nutrient-dense protein that we had never before been able to eat before. Through hunting, through foraging, we were able to eat animals and cook those animals and actually allow for our gut to become smaller. Because no longer were we eating plants all day long and sitting around and having it digest, but we could actually eat this meat, which allowed for our gut to be smaller and digest those proteins in a different way, but still providing those essential amino acids that we needed. So not only did our guts transform, but this also allowed for our brains to develop. We had this excess energy that we had no longer had before. And we have these teeth in our mouth, these canine teeth, that shows we're predispositioned to eat this meat. And what this really allowed us to do was not only have this excess energy, but also we now had the time to converse with each other. We now had the time to work on culture and cooking and doing different things and processing that meat that we were eating in a way that we hadn't done before by eating plants. So with this energy-efficient protein and a new digestive system, our brains were then able to evolve. So what does this mean? So an example here is that of a gorilla. A gorilla is an animal that is an herbivore. It eats all plants. And as you can see here, about 80% of the day, gorillas spend eating. So this not only means that they're just eating a relatively inefficient source of protein, which is plants, but they're also sitting around all day eating. They don't have the time to increase their intellectual capacity like we do. They don't have time to go out and spend time with each other and be spiritual or whatever they decide they might want to do. So then, going forward, it was gorillas who were eating a plant-based diet. But we, as humans, have been predispositioned to eat meat too. And it actually appears that I'm in agreement with one of the people that I'm debating against. Because according to John Mackey, we are actually eating part of a meat-based diet is completely ethical and actually very healthy. I'm not saying that you have to eat all meat, but the fact of eating meat is actually a very healthy thing for us humans to do. So that then brings me to my second part. So what type of meat should we be eating in this day and age, and what type of meat have we been eating over time? So silvopasture is an agricultural method that I suggest and that has been practiced for hundreds of years and is a great way to not only treat the animals ethically, but also humanely and make sure that their meat is healthy for us to eat. So how does this work? It's a combination of putting livestock in an area where you have trees, you also have other foraging plants. So you're actually able to have this closed loop in a way that you can't have in a confined animal feeding operation. What happens is these animals are allowed to eat the grass that they walk on, and then with that food, because the animals are herbivores, they're actually allowed to then, with their manure, they're fertilizing that soil. So what happens is as the grass gets eaten, the grass wants to grow, it sequesters the carbon dioxide needed for photosynthesis, and also those trees that are on that farm, on that silvopasture, are then able to sequester carbon as well because they're going through that same process of photosynthesis. And so this has incredible environmental benefits. So if we're looking at Project DRAWDOWN, which was just released in the past few years, on the top 80 solutions of how we can achieve and reverse climate change, silvopasture is up there as number 9 out of 80 solutions. And so what does that mean? Here we have the amount of CO2 that can be reduced through that sequestering of carbon, and other environmental benefits, not only the sequestering of carbon in the grasses and through the soil and the trees, but there's no waste runoff in a way that you have when the animals are in a confined space, right? So there's there's a stronger area, so there's no runoff. In addition, you're able to plant these silvopastures on hills, on mountainous terrain in a way that you haven't been able to. A confined animal feeding operation or plants cannot always be grown in mountainous areas. And so this is not just environmentally beneficial, but it's also financially beneficial for farmers who are often the ones that are left behind. It's more ethical to those farmers because they have multiple revenue streams. They're able to not only sell the ethically raised meat that's produced on that silvopasture, they're also able to sell the wood, the timber from their trees. And that is actually very profitable for them. They can also sell the nuts that are from the bushes that's in the silvopasture. And they can also sell the fruits that are grown on that silvopasture. So we have ethically raised meat, we have a lot of revenue for the farmers. So the farmers are being treated much more ethically. They're able to work outside. And so here's an example. Last night, I was in a class, and we had 3 farmers from Kenya come to speak to our class. And they were part of this TIST organization, the International Small Group and Tree Planting Program. And what did they say? You can see this is the farm of ALPHAXARD Kimani. He lives in Kenya, and these are his cows that are grazing in the silver pasture as I just described. And he, of course, talked about the environmental benefits. But what he also said is that he's able to provide food for his family. He's allowed to ensure the food security of his family. And this is him right here. And he's been able to pay off school fees in a way that not all the farmers in Kenya have been able to do because they haven't had the silver pasture farming that he has been able to incorporate. He's also able to sell the wood from his trees. And he's able to sell that off. And he doesn't have to buy charcoal. And that's just another way that he can actually be a much more profitable farmer and actually live a much more ethical life. So what are the final takeaways from these two arguments that I posed? So first, the final takeaway is that depriving humans of the meat that we're dispositioned to eat, that we have the teeth to eat, and meat that has helped us evolve over time, that has allowed our brains to develop and allowed us to create these scientific inventions that we never thought could be possible, depriving us of that meat, I believe, is unethical. That is not the way, and unhealthy. Not only, and we also have the ability to produce meat in a sustainable manner, right? We don't have to just produce meat in a confined area. And I will acknowledge that producing meat in an industrial way that we produce it in part of this country, in confined animal feeding operations, that is not an ethical nor a healthy way of producing meat. But that's not to say that there are other ways of producing meat that are completely ethical and completely healthy for us to eat. So though my opposition may say, oh, well, there's a binary choice. You either have factory farming or you have a 100% plant-based diet, I'm here to say there's a middle ground. There's no need for me to just be all vegan or just be all factory farming. Silver pasture is an example of a way where we can be in between. So I would ask you to make that choice. And I would also say to make sure when we're examining this debate that we're talking about the ethics of eating meat, not the ethics of eating plants. So we're talking about the ethical and health effects of meat. So as you go on, make sure that you're thinking about this choice. There's not binary, it's not a binary choice, and we have the ability to be both ethical and healthy eating meat. Thank you.
Tech support.
Got the blank screen. Escape. Thank you. And that's John.
There we go. That one, yeah. Thanks. Well, just want to start out by saying I'm going to focus on the health aspects of the risk of eating meat, and my debate partner Bruce is going to focus more on the environmental and the ethical issues. And then in rebuttal, we will refute some of the things that he said, which I don't think are true, and in some cases are ridiculous. Such as our teeth are clearly, we have herbivore teeth, gang. We don't have the big carnivorous teeth that you find in animals that are basically carnivores. But let's get going here on that. Let's see. It's true in my book, written by 3 vegans, that we recommended 90+% plant-based, up to 100%. All 3 of us 100%. We think that's best. We just think a little bit of animal foods is still consistent with good health. Unfortunately, the average American eats 34% of their calories in animal foods. So if they were to cut down to like 5%, that would be a massive improvement in their health, and I hope to prove that. We have a very fat country. I don't know if you've become aware of that yet. 71% are overweight, 38% are obese, and it's not leveling out. Look what's happened over the past almost 45 years. That's the obesity increase. It is not just a U.S. problem. We're getting fat all over the world. The whole world is getting fat. It's astounding. He talked about how we evolved. We evolved craving calorie-dense foods. We like things that have a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of protein, and a lot of fat, because the human condition was against starvation. That was our biggest risk, was to starve to death. So we like calorie-dense foods, and animal foods are some of the most calorie-dense foods available. So we like them. We like the way they taste, and that's why people eat them, because we're rich enough to eat them every single day. And that's part of the problem. Not eating it a little bit. Those cavemen we were looking at, the reality is we evolved from primates as the gorillas, which are 100% vegan, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, who we're most closely genetically connected to, are about 95% vegan, and about 5% of their calories come from animals. So today, the foods have actually been altered to increase calorie density. So we like calorie-dense fats. We like oil, we like sugar, we like refined grains, and we like all types of animal foods, which I'm about to prove to you. As a result, this is why we're getting fat. The calorie intake has increased 25% per capita since 1970. Here's what calorie density looks like in our stomachs. And the most calorie-dense food in the world is actually vegetable oil. If I had a little more time, I'd tell you why you don't want to consume vegetable oil. There's no food you can eat that'll get you fat quicker than oil. Cheese is like next. And then there's meat and dead animals of all types. Then you start getting to the starch, whole grains, beans, things like that. They fill up our stomach. They give us a feeling of satiety. And then fruits and vegetables are the least calorie-dense, and they're the most nutrient-dense foods we can eat. Here's meat consumption. It's increased 70% per capita since 1940. Due to the good work of some of the animal activists in the room, it's beginning to come down a little bit, although it's spiking up in the rest of the world. But we're still at 70% above 1940 rates. And you can see, you notice something, animal food consumption is going up. What else is going up? We're getting fat. There's not an accident there. They're really closely connected. All calorie-dense foods, which we are rich enough to eat all the time, ultimately make us fat and sick and cause diseases. Cheese consumption. If you go back 100 years ago, average per capita was 3 pounds. Now it's 37.1 pounds. I eat 0. Somebody here, and you know who you are, is probably eating 74 pounds of cheese a year. Seventh-day Adventist study, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But you can see the vegans are the thinnest of the Seventh-day Adventists in this test. And then the lacto-vegetarians are next. Then the pesco, the ones that eat fish, semi-vegetarian, and the non-vegetarian, they're the ones moving towards obesity. Here's a claim I'll make, which I challenge our debate opponents to refute. All major studies show an increase in all-cause disease and death from low-carbohydrate diets, which are equivalent to a heavy animal foods diet, since plants have carbohydrates and animal foods don't have carbohydrates. No studies of high-carbohydrate diets show similar effects. Red meat consumption and mortality. Here's some studies. So the Harvard School of Public Health, the largest study ever conducted on meat and survival, followed 120,000 people for 22 to 28 years. For every 2 to 3 ounce serving of meat that you eat a day, your risk of dying goes up 13%. So if you're chopping down a 16-ounce T-bone every day, your risk is going up 50, 60% on a baseline to those who are not consuming meat. Processed meats are even worse. Bacon, ham, bologna, salami. You're looking at, for every 2 to 3 ounce serving, you got a 20% increase of death. Here's one based on Swedish women that were followed, 43,000 women, 30 to 49 years old. They were followed for 15 years. And the conclusion was low carbohydrate, high protein diets are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. You can see it here. The more animal protein they ate, the more cardiovascular risk, the more cardiovascular disease that was seen. Here's an interesting study. 6,000 people from the ages of 50 to 65 were followed for 18 years. There's a 4x increased risk of cancer death for those compared to those with lower animal protein intake. For 23x, even at moderate animal food consumption, you have a 23 times greater risk of developing diabetes. And if you're a heavy meat eater, you have 73 times the risk of developing diabetes. And overall, in the 18-year period, there's a 75% increase in overall mortality for those people who are high animal foods consumers. Here you can see the cancer risk itself, 4-fold increase of risk. Colon cancer, 1,000+ studies now. The data is so overwhelming. That's the challenge that we can go back and look at some cavemen from millions of years ago, perhaps. We don't actually have any, we can compare against. We can speculate on that. But we do know that a heavy red meat and processed meat diet increases the risk of colon cancer tremendously, whereas a plant-based diet tends to prevent it, and in some cases it can possibly even reverse it. So bad is processed meat that the World Health Organization has classified processed meats as a Class 1 carcinogen. That's right up there with tobacco and asbestos. Breast cancer. This is based on studies from 87 different countries. They followed animal food consumption for a long period of time, and there's a lag. When you eat meat, cancer doesn't break out the next day. It takes a long time for cancer to grow in our systems. So there tends to be a lag period of about 15 to 25 years. And by the way, most of this was not factory farm animal foods. Most of this was pasture raised, not feedlot. Here you can see the higher the percentage of calories that come from animal foods, the higher the rate of breast cancer that shows up 19 years later. It's just linear. More meat you eat, the greater your risk for cancer and cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Make a quick case for whole foods plant-based diets. So again, we think health, a little bit of animal foods is consistent with good health, a little bit. As I said, the ethics that Bruce is going to prove, I'm an ethical vegan. I don't eat animal foods because I just simply think it's wrong to do it. But I think you can eat a little bit and still be healthy. The key is a little bit. One of the myths that meat eaters like to put out there is that meat is so full. Where do you get your protein from? If you don't drink milk, where do you get your calcium? It's such a myth because it's the plant foods that are the most nutrient-dense foods, not the animal foods. They like to do, and they do these short-term studies funded by the animal foods industry, they like to compare against the bottom. They like to compare against refined grains, oil, and sugar. And guess what? Animal foods are more nutrient-dense than those foods. If you compare against those, you're going to get pretty good results. Start comparing against the leafy green vegetables, beans, starchy vegetables, and you'll see animal foods don't look so good. They don't have nearly the nutrient density per calorie. The best of the animal foods is fish. It's one of the reasons the pescatarians on that Seventh-day Adventist study did have lower obesity rates than the pure omnivores. The blue zones. These are studies of the longest-lived people on this planet. There are 5 that have been identified and documented by Dan Buettner and his work. He's written some great books on it. 5 places: Okinawa, Japan, Icaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Nicoya, Costa Rica, and believe it or not, Loma Linda, California, where the Seventh-day Adventists are concentrated. Guess what diet these folks eat? 90% whole plant foods, and on average about 10% animal foods. The Okinawans, these folks, 96% vegan diet, 98% vegetarian diet. They get 70% of their calories from just sweet potatoes. You can live on just sweet potatoes. 85% of carbohydrate diet, 9% protein. So it's a very low protein, low fat diet, very high carbohydrate diet. It's saturated in vegetables, particularly sweet potatoes. Seventh-day Adventist study. The thing I'll point out here is the vegan Seventh-day Adventists, on average, live 14 years longer than the average Caucasian American, and the females live 10 years longer than average. The men, 60% lower risk of cancer, 76% lower of heart disease. Women, 66% lower risk of cancer, and an incredible 98% lower risk of heart disease. The most important doctor, one of the most important doctors the last 50 years is Dean Ornish, because the biggest killer in America, the people die from heart disease more than any other disease, more than cancer, and when you add stroke in there as another type of cardiovascular disease, the cardiovascular diseases are what are killing us. And Ornish proved on diet alone you can prevent it and in many cases reverse it. It's like a medical breakthrough and nobody cares because people do not want to stop eating meat. They don't want to give up their calorie-dense foods, which they're seriously addicted to, even though you can prevent the leading killer of death from even occurring. It's amazing that the media has not made this into a much bigger deal than it is. Here's my challenge. Where are the studies and who are the doctors that are curing heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune diseases based on animal food diets? There are all these studies that show eating a plant food-based diet prevents and reverses these diseases. I know of none that show doctors reversing it. So what we need to do is get you on a heavy animal foods diet because that's what the caveman ate. And you're not gonna have to waste a lot of time chomping on vegetables when you can just get that energy right into yourself. At Whole Foods, we do something called a 7-day Immersion. We take our sickest team members, those who have heart disease, those who have diabetes, those who are obese, and at the cost of the company, we send them to a 7-day total immersion medically supervised program where we take control of their diet for 1 week, and we do intensive education about healthy eating. They're all plant-based, and we've got about 4,000 team members that have come through this program at this point. I can't go into a store at Whole Foods Market where I don't have somebody come up and hug me because they feel like I saved their lives, that they've lost. Well, we've got some examples. Here's one, Stacy Moore. She lost 51 pounds. She can successfully convert her whole family to a plant-based diet. These are the average that occurs in just 1 week. Drop your cholesterol 23 points, your triglycerides 28 points, your blood pressure 7.4 in just 7 days on a Whole Foods plant-based diet. It's incredible. Here's Jennifer Dupree. She lost 73 pounds in 7 months. She stopped having to use her allergy medicine. Her immune system strengthened, her hair, her nails, her knee pain went away. She sleeps better. Marty Jenkins, store team leader in one of our Sacramento stores. He dropped 90 pounds, reversed his type 2 diabetes. His blood pressure dropped from 156 over 96 to 115 over 75. He's no longer diabetic. This guy weighed 350 pounds. He suffered severe depression, drug addiction, fast food addiction, suicidal thoughts. He almost died of a drug. He was addicted to Adderall, almost died from it. Type 2 diabetes. Here he is today. He's now a health coach at Whole Foods. He lost 185 pounds. He got off his drugs. It's astounding. So, I welcome the next speaker.
Which one is you?
I'm that one. Yep.
And how we do?
And then file view. You can go view up top. Right there. And then go full screen mode. Cool. Is this gonna mess it up if I put it right here?
No, and then that's
Cool. Woo. All right, can everybody hear me? Perfect. So before we dive in, I think we should acknowledge the makeup of our panel of debaters. We're all white, and 3 out of 4 of us are male. So with that into consideration, that's slightly problematic considering we're debating the ethics and the health of eating meat for a global population, and the global population is not that makeup. In an attempt to address this issue, my collaborators and I have made efforts to draw from diverse sources to address this issue of eating meat. In particular, we include perspectives outside of the Western and colonial framework. With this in mind, I've been asked to speak about this subject today of eating meat and show that meat eaters should neither be morally condemned and that there are real merits to the consumption of meat. I hope to present this information and highlight perspectives that aren't often included in the conversations around meat, but obviously it's ultimately up to you all as an audience to come to your own determination. So I'd like to start off by looking more intently at this question of, is eating meat ethical and healthy? Ooh, hold on, let me just, there we go. So instead of calling into question the industrial agricultural processes, which include both animal and plant agriculture, this question sidesteps all of those issues and doesn't address how plant and animal agriculture contributes to climate change, accelerated biodiversity loss, land degradation through soil erosion, compaction and salinization, and pollution. It also depletes and pollutes our water resources and other natural resources, contributes to rural decline, and a host of other issues that impact communities across the globe to varying degrees. The question that we address today does not challenge this system inherently. Rather, it focuses on personal choice, rather than institutional and structural change. And there are many problems with focusing exclusively on personal choice. First, personal choice presumes a certain level of autonomy. However, personal autonomy is wrapped up in structures of class, race, gender, citizenship, and a plethora of other identity issues. In short, autonomy exists in degrees, not as a constant. Our opponents failed to address this critically important nuance. Second, the question itself, in its current formulation, blames individual consumers for their actions. As we saw, a lot of fat-shaming rhetoric just happened, which inherently blames individuals instead of looking at systemic change. Posing this question in this particular way, as opposed to saying, how can we make the food system more just, is problematic and effectively lets corporations off the hook for the damage they cause in the industrial production of meat and plants, and allows for the continued concentration of power in the hands of the few. So with that understanding, I hope you all keep that in the back of your mind as you're listening to these arguments. So now I'd like to turn towards and address how meat eating can in fact be ethical. So I'm going to address three main issues: the environment, animals, and the social impact of eating meat. So first, let's look at the environment. As Isaac said, we totally concede that industrial animal agriculture is not positive and doesn't do positive things for the environment. And instead, we're advocating for diversified farming, which includes the grazing practices that Isaac talks about, but in particular, it looks to shift towards animal and plant agriculture working together and being grown together and simultaneously. This system has been shown to have positive impacts on the environment. It uses less energy inputs like pesticides and fertilizers and other hazardous chemicals. And in the system, animals distribute nutrients to high elevation or steep grounds that are hard to reach and usually not ideal for crop cultivation, hereby utilizing land that could not be used in plant-only agricultural systems. And it's more environmentally beneficial for the planet, these sort of systems that incorporate both animals and plants. Therefore, this form of agriculture helps introduce moisture into the soil, protects against pests, prevents soil erosion, and contributes to soil health through manure and the movement of animals. Furthermore, animals maximize efficiency. Animals are able to convert resources that humans can't eat, like grass and other food scraps, to protein for human consumption. Related to this, animals in these diversified or integrated farm systems also eat products that would be considered failures in crop-only agriculture, plant-only agriculture. Here we're thinking about things like low rainfall periods or other natural disasters that lead to food waste. But in diversified farm system, those things that would be considered food waste can be reused as feed for animals, and therefore decreases the amount of food waste we have on farms. Animal grazing is also incredibly helpful and allows for the use of land, which is unfit for crop cultivation. And some estimates say that that land that is used for grazing in the US, if we took that away, is the size of 4 Californias, which is a lot of land. Additionally, grazing is a form of fire reduction because it allows animals to graze on land with high-density vegetation prone to fires. And especially with the immense amount of fires in the West this summer, I think we can all agree that animals are an integral part of preserving the environment. And there's also a widely stated fact that livestock agriculture contributes to more than 18%, and some even say 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the entire transportation industry combined. And when I heard that, to be completely honest, it changed my mind about the way in which we look at eating animals. But more recent scholars, and even the FAO, which originally put forward this 18% statistic, has called that number into question for its poor methodology. Recently, more detailed and diligent studies by these same organizations have slashed their previous estimates by upwards of 33%. Lastly, let's consider something that people often fawn over as a reason to not eat meat for environmental preservation: plant-based proteins like the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger. While these sort of innovations aren't inherently bad, they again distract from the issue of of going against industrial agriculture systems and instead create a new industry based on the idea that animal agriculture is bad, which is inherently creating a whole new industry to profit off of, instead of trying to eliminate the issues with animal agriculture. And something that entrepreneurs obviously have a vested interest, therefore, in promoting rhetoric that their products are more environmentally friendly than meat eating. And in terms of plant-based proteins, the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger both use commodity crops like wheat, soy, and peas now, which are part of monocrop industrial agriculture processes, and also contribute to pollution, land degradation, soil erosion, and a host of other issues, hereby creating and adding to the problems of industrial plant agriculture instead of working to create a more diversified farming system in the US and really globally. And now for a more intentionally global perspective, like Isaac said, many communities depend on animals. And to villainize them for not being ethical because they use and eat animals is completely absurd. And yes, for those of you in the room that are thinking this is absolutely great, sustainable farming sounds awesome, but can it really feed the world? Yes, it can. Recommendations from the UN, World Bank, and other research groups have said that small-scale and medium-sized diversified agriculture actually has the ability to feed the entire world. And right now we produce enough food for 10 billion people, which is around what the population estimate is for 2050. So this issue of feeding the world is really a distribution rather than a production issue. Now let's consider animal rights. In many debates around eating meat and in prior debates, Bruce has asked this question: who thinks if you can make a decision that helps rather than harms animals, you should? And obviously, everyone raises their hand because that's a leading question. Who would willingly admit to wanting to hurt animals? Not necessarily anyone. And there are a couple issues with this line of reasoning. First and foremost is the idea of speciesism. So speciesism is the idea that you shouldn't discriminate based on species, certain species of animals. Essentially, this concept is used to say that eating meat is a form of discrimination based on animal species, and that we should not eat meat because animals in industrial, like livestock animals, are on the same level playing field as humans. So if that's true, and we shouldn't discriminate based on species, then what does it mean when we own animals? Could you compare that to a form of slavery if we're all in the same playing field? Obviously, it's not the same thing, but I think that you could get there. Furthermore, in arguments, people often ask, if you would not eat your pet, why would you eat a cow? And this universalized the idea of what a pet is. Pets in the US are not pets globally. And every society has their different idea of pets. And posing this question by playing into the cultural normalities of Americans, particularly white westernized Americans, is unethical because it reinforces the colonial ideas of morality, which in this case is determined by those with money and power. Therefore, the argument of not eating meat because it is morally superior, i.e. ethical, is inherently false, culturally insensitive, classist, and demeaning, because those who make these decisions are usually those with money and power, which, again, in this society is linked with whiteness and often maleness. We cannot stand idly by and conveniently ignore the complication of these questions at hand. Rather, we must examine our own biases and cultural predispositions and seek not to reinforce westernized colonial norms that when considering the notion of eating meat. Second, if we're going to say that as humans we should not eat meat, should any animals eat meat, If speciesism says that you shouldn't discriminate based on an animal species, should any animals be able to eat meat? And if we deprive animals of nutrient-dense meats, that can affect their health and can also affect the balance of the global food chain. And the opposite of a meat-eating diet is a plant-based diet, which is seen as not contributing to animal suffering. However, deforestation and plowing for agriculture in order to grow these large harvested plants also negatively affects animals. Deforestation created for crop agriculture and now increasingly vegetable oils, like palm oil, results in habitat loss and loss of hundreds of species. And plowing in non-industrial agriculture uses herbicides and pesticides, which can result in a slow poisoning of animals, which some could argue is worse or more painful than slaughter. Furthermore, if one makes the argument that eating animals is cruel and unethical, then why distinguish between different types of animals, from a mouse to a cow? The final part I want to discuss in this debate is the social issues that arise from eating meat. First, I want to again tie this back to the idea of animals. A lot of rhetoric around not eating meat says that it's cruelty-free. When you don't consume any animal products, you're essentially eating something that's cruelty-free. And that inherently is not true. And I would pose a question for folks who say cruelty-free, that their diets are cruelty-free. Are you looking into the labor practices of the farmers that are getting your food from farm to table? Because globally, there's been a proliferation and so many examples of instances of modern-day slavery and exploitation in our farming system for plants. Therefore, choosing to eat meat does not necessarily mean that your diet is cruelty-free. There's also a plethora of social issues that are often brought up in this debate of eating meat, that when you don't consume animal products, you're helping with social issues like poverty, hunger, and global warming. And some folks may choose vegetarian and veganism because of acts of resistance to oppression, state-sanctioned violence, and because of cultural practices and values. And we're not calling that into question. That is completely aside from this point. However, other communities, like First Nation communities in Canada, some Native American communities here, and Native Hawaiian communities in others, meat is an integral part of their cultural foodway. And to say it is unethical to eat meat completely erases those ways of being and is inherently imperialistic because it imposes cultural values and social norms on the practices of other communities from a white westernized standpoint. And by making blanket statements about the ethics of eating meat without looking into the way colonialism in the US has created industrial animal agriculture and concentrated feeding operations is unethical. We need to make sure that we have all of that historical knowledge when arguing about eating meat. And lastly, related to the fact that eating meat will help eliminate poverty, eating meat does not inherently create poverty. Instead, capitalism, racism, patriarchy, imperialism, legacies of colonialism, lack of political will, and a whole bunch of other social issues create poverty and inequity around the globe. And also, by focusing on meat, whether you eat meat or you don't eat meat, enables a group of people that don't eat meat to profit off of that rhetoric, which is essentially profiting off of the exploitation and the stories of exploitation of a whole entire other people. And by focusing on the meat issue, you don't actually address the large environmental costs that it's supposedly attempting to solve. Instead, it may be helpful when we're thinking about to eat meat or not to eat meat to pose and look at how we can create more diversified farm systems and look towards policymaking that favors integrating plant and animal production, small and medium-sized farms, and less corporate control as a way to feed the world. In summation, I would like to encourage everyone to think critically. What are our own biases? Where do they come from? And how does that affect the question that we're debating today? How can some of us in the room use our power and privilege to change the institutions and the structural issues that contribute to these issues? I want to leave off by reminding everyone that this question distracts from the problem of industrial food and instead focuses on personal choice without analyzing structural factors. Thank you.
Before we get started, apropos nothing, did people hear that Bill Gates bought the Seattle Times this morning? He buys it every morning. I could do this all night. All right.
We need one more. Give us
One more. Why is the alphabet in that order? Because of that song. How many animal rights activists does it take to change a light bulb? One, and that's not funny! All right. I could keep going, but I'm not going to. Participation time together for just a minute. How many people in here like pasta? All right, we have almost unanimity on pasta. For those of you who are anti-gluten, you can get gluten-free pasta. How many people here would go to your refrigerator, take out 8 plates of pasta, throw them in the trash, and eat 1 plate of pasta? Yeah. It's occasionally somebody who's like, bring it on, end of the world! But nobody in this audience. And yet that's essentially what we're doing every time we choose to eat meat. The most efficient meat is chicken, and according to the World Resources Institute, it takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out in the form of that animal's flesh. The vast majority of what we feed to a chicken, the chicken expends simply existing. And this just makes intuitive sense. I weigh about 180 pounds. If I do nothing but lay in bed watching reruns of the Jerry Springer Show, I'm going to burn like 2,400 calories a day. Except when something exciting is happening on the screen, I'm Jerry, Jerry, Jerry. Then it ticks up a little bit when I get excited when something awesome's happening. That same sort of relationship is true for farm animals. Not that they have the bad taste to watch Jerry Springer, but that the vast majority of the calories that you feed to a chicken or a pig or a cow or any farm animal, the vast majority of the calories that you feed to that animal, she or he expends simply existing. Again, the most efficient meat is chicken. It takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. So who here has heard of and is concerned about food waste? Okay, almost everybody has heard of and is concerned about food waste. Who thinks food waste is an ethical issue? Who thinks we should ignore food waste and focus on capitalism and patriarchy? Okay, just checking. The latest issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences says that the inefficiency of the meat industry dwarfs food waste in terms of how much food is wasted. We waste about 40% of all food that's produced in the United States. And that should be concerning. That is an ethical issue. But remember, food wasted in the production of chicken, the most efficient meat, is 20 times as bad. It's literally 800% food waste. And this is indeed an ethical issue because, as the World Watch Institute puts it, meat production is an inefficient use of grain. The grain is used more efficiently when consumed by humans. Continued growth in meat output is dependent on feeding grain to animals, creating competition for grain between affluent meat eaters and the world's poor. It is literally the case that there is 10 times as much grain that is fed to farm animals than is put into biofuels, even as people are arguing over whether biofuels is a human rights crime because it diverts grain into fuel while more than 800 million people in the developing world are starving. For this reason alone, because every single time we choose to eat meat, we're essentially throwing away 8 to 25 calories for every calorie we're consuming. For this reason alone, eating meat is unethical. But it's quite a bit worse than that. It's not just the calories in and the calories out. You have 9 times as much grain, so that's 9 times as much land, 9 times as much pesticide and herbicide, 9 times as much gasoline going into the combines, 9 times as much water required. And then you grow all of that grain and you have to ship it to a feed mill. You have to operate a feed mill. Then you have to ship that feed to the farm and you have to operate the farm. You have to ship the animals to the slaughterhouse and you have to operate the slaughterhouse. It's like 3 or 4 extra stages of gas-guzzling, pollution-spewing vehicles, as well as energy-intensive and pollution-spewing factories. And once you crunch the numbers, as the United Nations agricultural economists did, what you find is that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from local to global. that animal agriculture contributes to problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. And on the issue of climate change, whether it's 18% or 14% or 15%, or 50%, and agricultural economists disagree and they fight for their little area of this issue, even if it is 30% less of 18%, that's still more than every plane and train and automobile and truck in existence. Just last year, agricultural economists writing in the journal Nature, they looked at chicken, which is the least climate change-inducing meat, and what they determined in the peer-reviewed journal Nature is that chicken causes 40 times as much climate change per calorie of protein when compared to legumes and peas, when compared to things like peas and chickpeas and other legumes, 40 times as much. So it's literally the case, again, that every time you're choosing to eat meat, who here cares about climate change, by the way? All right, not a Trump voting audience, apparently. Any Scott Pruitt fans? All right, if you raise your hand, you might be ushered out or something. But so for those of us who care about climate change, the idea that we would eat something that causes 40 times as much climate change per calorie than something else that we could be eating instead, and that's chicken, the least climate change-inducing meat, that alone is also a moral issue. And then finally, the issue of animal protection. And I'm not, I believe that we should not create artificial biases. I believe that discriminating, if you are going to make a judgment about moral worth, you should compare issues that actually matter in terms of measuring a being's capacity to experience whatever that thing is. But you don't have to go to speciesism in order to determine that causing animals to suffer so that we can eat is unnecessary. Now, I don't think it is at all imperialist. I mean, there's certainly a who here would eat this cat? I know, my wife would beat you up. She would track you, she'd come to your house if you decided to eat Rena. But even if you didn't know Rena, very few people in this room are willing to eat Rena. Well, we saw how many people raised their hand for eating meat, which means that most of you are eating chicken. You probably wouldn't eat Beaky. She's a resident at Farm Sanctuary. But if you eat chicken, you would eat an animal like Beaky. Probably most people aren't going to eat chompers, and most people are going to eat an animal like Linus. And it's true that your bias in favor of chompers and Rena is a sort of cultural bias. But I think it speaks well of you that you recognize that we should not be eating some animals. But it also speaks ill of you, the irrationality that causes you to say it's okay to eat some animals, but not to eat other animals. Because indeed, there is no moral difference between eating Rena or Beaky or chompers or Linus. And I think you would be hard-pressed to come up with one. I like what the poet Percy Shelley, in explaining his vegetarianism, he said, "I want no part of anything I can't write a pleasant poem about." I want no part of anything I can't write a pleasant poem about. I can't write a pleasant poem about anything. I'm not a poet. But I like the concept. I think there's something about basic integrity that we shouldn't pay other people to do things that we would find to be morally problematic. I'm guessing most people in this room wouldn't want to spend an afternoon in a slaughterhouse slitting chickens' throats open. Anybody? Yeah, most people don't want to see it, they don't want to do it, they don't want to think about it. So ask yourself how it's ethical to pay other people to do things to animals that you don't even, you get qualms just thinking about, right? Again, if we care about animal protection, if we don't want people to pay people to be gratuitously abusive of animals, third independent reason that eating meat is unethical. And then finally, to just recap some of the things that John said, the book, The China Study, found a linear increase in cancer rate as animal product consumption went up from 0. So the challenge of the affirmative is not, our challenge is not to say, if you eat any meat at all, you're going to die. Their challenge is to say, eating meat is healthy. And you look at John's statistics, the people who ate the most meat had like 4 times the cancer rate, 7 times the diabetes rate, 4 times the heart disease rate. The diets that actually unclogged people's arteries and made them healthier were all completely vegetarian diets. So like smoking, if you only smoke a couple cigarettes a day, that's unlikely to be your cause of death in the end. Good luck proving that smoking a couple of cigarettes a day is healthy. Same thing with meat eating. So maybe, less is certainly better than more, as with, anything unhealthy. But the healthiest diets, as John pointed out, are the completely vegetarian diets. Prevent and reverse heart disease. Up until 30 years ago, it was assumed as we got older, if something else didn't kill us, our arteries would clog up and we die of heart disease. Now there's a diet that actually unclogs your arteries and makes people heart attack proof. And it's a completely vegetarian diet. And then as John pointed out with the Adventists, the healthiest Adventists were the vegan Adventists, and they had the lowest rates of heart disease, cancer, and obesity. So Isaac talked about silvopasture, Kenya, growing where plants won't grow. I did actually think that what we were debating in this debate and what we were talking about is like, what should we be eating? So is eating meat healthy for us? Is eating meat ethical for us? And I would point out that organic meat is 0.5% of all meat sales. And good luck getting anything in the cafeteria that comes from silvopasture or the Kenyan farmer who he cited up here. But even with silvopasture and the Kenyan farmer, if you dive into it, it's less bad, but it's not actually good, and it's not necessary. Second point, speciesism versus animal welfare, and is it cruelty-free? I mean, again, I would just challenge people, think about ethics. Who here thinks it would be unethical to gratuitously abuse a chicken, to gratuitously abuse a dog or a cat, and then to eat her? No? Is it unethical to gratuitously abuse a dog or a cat and then eat the dog or cat? Yeah, most people are raising their hands for that being unethical. Grapple for yourself with the idea of paying somebody, entering into a mercenary relationship wherein you pay somebody to gratuitously abuse a chicken or a pig or another animal in order to eat that animal. Yeah, the meat health issue. And then I certainly resonate with what Mackenzie said about the value of doing a systems analysis. And it's certainly true that there are other harms that we could be addressing. But it's also, that should not become an excuse to do nothing. You could make that sort of analysis for why we shouldn't care about food waste, why we shouldn't care about what we're driving, why we shouldn't care about really kind of addressing any other issue at all, if it all boils down to the harms of cultural values and social norms and patriarchy and all of the other harms that she laid out. It's still valuable to ask ourselves, what are we doing in the world and how are we behaving in the world? And the reality is that every single time we sit down to eat, we're making a choice about who we are in the world. Are we somebody who wants to, basically tromp over the planet in combat boots, or are we somebody who believes in walking gently on the earth? Are we somebody who believes in acting for the global poor or against the global poor? Do we care about animal protection, or do we oppose animal protection? So for at least 3 independent reasons, we contend that eating meat is unethical, and it's also unhealthy, and we challenge you to eat a veggie burger instead. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our 4 presenters. If you have a question, please write it down on your cards and pass them to the aisles, and we'll have some students come pick them up. And I now would like to invite up Paul Root-Wolpe, who is the director for the Center for Ethics, for a few minutes while the teams meet and talk about their rebuttals. Yes.
So,
And I think in your conclusion, you should just
what's
tell
going to
us.
happen now is I'm just going to say a few words. The teams are going to work on their rebuttals, and then they'll come up and just have a very brief rebuttal. I thought that both teams made compelling cases. It'll be interesting to see how they address each other's points. As Jonathan said, I'm Paul Root-Wolpe, director of the Center for Ethics. This program is primarily designed by the Center for Ethics and sponsored by the Center for Ethics. Our center is a unique center in the United States. There isn't another center like it. We're an independent center under the provost. We are not a bioethics center, as most ethics centers in the United States are. We're a general ethics center so that we can present programs like this. We have extraordinary programs in areas like ethics in the arts, ethics and servant leadership, neuroethics, and other programs where we partner with regional and national and international partners to try to ask very deep questions about the nature of the world around us. I have a kind of unique definition of what ethics is. I think ethics is simply how we decide, assess, and express our values in the world. And that is something we do at all times. You are expressing values by being here tonight. We express values by the choices we make, and that's what this debate is about. What kinds of choices do we make about what we eat? Whatever choice we make has ethical valence. Jonathan Crane has recently published a book, Eating Ethically, Religion and Science for a Better Diet. I highly recommend it. It's an interesting and probing and insightful conversation about many of the issues we're talking about tonight, but also brings in other elements like religious histories, thought about the idea of proper eating, and ideas like satiety and how you make decisions about what is ethical and not ethical to put in your body. Eating Ethically is a wonderful little blurb on the back by John Mackey. And I strongly encourage you to come to our website, ethics.emory.edu, see the extraordinary programs that we run, get involved in the center for the students out there. The center, which is on the first floor of the Candler School of Theology building, is a place that you can come, learn about the center, engage in programs. We have an art gallery, we have a library, we have places to sit and work, and the center is a resource for this university that is a unique kind of resource that we should all be using. So, how are we doing in terms of time? 1 more minute. I want to thank the sponsors of today's program, our partners. We in the center have an ethic of collaboration and partnership. We rarely run programs by ourselves. We like to bring in partners from not only Emory, like the Goizueta School of Business, who's a partner in tonight's program, but also in the community, like Whole Foods, and other partners that we have in all of our programs. In our Ethics and Servant Leadership program, we have many, many not-for-profits, 40 or 50 not-for-profits we partner with. In our Ethics in the Arts program, we partner with regional arts organizations. I really think that that in itself is an ethical stance to take. Part of what we're seeing in society today is an inability for people with different perspectives and from different political stances to have reasonable, civil dialogue. You know, there's an old joke. I'm Jewish, so it's very common in the Jewish community to say, Jews don't listen, they wait. And that's not dialogue, right? Waiting for the other person to finish so you can jump in with your rebuttal is not dialogue. We all do that. We see too much of that in popular culture now. Too much waiting and not enough listening. We see a lot of times when people are trying to score political points rather than understand their opponents. So I want the center to be a place where we all listen, not just wait. I'm very proud of the fact that Emory University is a place where people come and listen even to people who have opposing viewpoints. They come and listen respectfully to those viewpoints. I invite you to be part of that and part of the Center for Ethics programming. So, now I'd like to invite Jonathan back up, have him shepherd our last 5-minute rebuttals, and then be interested for those of you who want to hang for a few minutes to talk about how you think this debate has fallen out and which side you think made the valuable points.
Thank you, Paul. I'd now like to invite up the teams for a rebuttal. I would like to invite our guests to have the first rebuttal. You get 5 minutes as a team. Okay, great. Come on up. And the conclusion, yes, this rebuttal is wrapping up your side's presentations.
Got it. So I'm only going to rebut a few things. I'm going to end by telling you a story. Oh yeah, Mike. Sorry, I'm used to that happening automatically. Sorry, I'm just troublemaker. Good? Can you hear me? Well, because you're in the back. People in the front can hear me. How about now? Yes? Okay, good. So just a few things that I think are inaccurate I want to rebut. So kind of the whole evolutionary argument that we're like, we evolved to eat meat. And it's clearly not true. You just look at if you look at our digestive system, if you look at our teeth, if you look at our saliva, which has got amylase in it, which is helps digest starches. No other primate, for example, has amylase. We are basically starchivores. We can't even eat meat. I mean, like a carnivore, cat or something like that, eats it raw. Human beings, we got to cook it, we got to break it down. We couldn't digest it. We did begin to eat meat because we were probably starving to death. We were just trying to find some source of food, and it was calorie dense, and we somewhat adapted to it. But if you look at our great ape heritage, we're basically plant eaters who eat a little bit of animal foods. That's how human beings have evolved. The pasture argument they made is deeply flawed because the alternative, they kept saying, well, you don't need to, you can't grow crops everywhere. So you should have this pasture land and animals can graze on it. But from a global warming standpoint, wherever you can grow any pasture, you can pretty much grow trees. And trees are far superior at carbon sequestering than pasture land is. So we see in New England, for example, which is marginal farmland, farms have been abandoned there and they've been recaptured by the trees. Something most people and Americans do not know is that the United States is actually not shrinking its tree count anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. We actually have more dense forests today than we had 100 years ago. That's partly due to agricultural lands being returned to trees. And if we didn't have to have so much agricultural land growing crops to feed the animals, we'd have a heck of a lot more trees on this planet. Yeah, the whole cultural relativism argument and exploitation, and I just found that one very disingenuous, almost attempt to change the subject. When, I mean, of course we are going to make ethical judgments of potentially different cultures. Otherwise, we couldn't make any answers to child exploitation or the oppression of women or human trafficking or kidnappings or anything else any other culture is doing. We'd have to remain mute and silent. And I think that's a very disingenuous argument. And actually, I think an attempt to change the argument perhaps to something our debaters are more comfortable arguing rather than what this debate topic's really about. So actually, I want to conclude now by just telling you a story. So this is a true story, which is why I like to conclude with it. So back in 2004, my wife and I, we got to meet Milton and Rose Friedman. They were 92 years old at that time. It's just a couple of years before Milton died. And we were introduced through mutual friends, and we went into San Francisco to take them out to dinner. And of course, Milton knew that I was a vegan, so we arranged to go at kind of a famous, world-famous vegetarian restaurant called Green's, which was pretty near where Milton lived. So we show up at the apartment, and he gives us a drink, and he shows us his Nobel Prize in economics, which was very cool. And then we're trying to make small talk, and so Milton kind of out of the blue says, "John, why are you a vegan? I just don't understand that. Why are you a vegan?" I said, "Milton, are you sure you want to know?" And he said, "Yes, I really would like to know." And I said, "Well, I'm going to make an argument as to why I'm a vegan. And if you can answer the argument, I'll stop being a vegan. However, if you can't answer it, I know you're a man of great intellectual integrity. I would expect you to become a vegan. He looks at me and he says, let's do it. Okay, Milton, the first part of the argument is, if you eat animals, the animals necessarily have to die. And if you're eating any kind of meat that's probably grown in America, 99% of it's come from factory farms, and it was at horrible lives. Just, if you really knew what we were doing to animals in America, they're all hidden away from the American people. If you knew, you'd be horrified. Our debate opponents basically wanted to make an argument against the factory farms. They did not want to identify with that. But the reality is, in America, 99% of the food is factory farm animal foods. Most of my competitors, that's what they sell, and they may try to argue differently, or they put up some marketing materials. It bothers me greatly because I know they're being very deceptive. But anyway, back to the argument. And the animals, for the most part, had these horrible lives. Number two, you don't need to eat animals to be healthy. In fact, the evidence is sort of overwhelming that the less animal food you eat, the longer you live, the less risk you have for heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity, autoimmune diseases. As Bruce pointed out, it's almost a linear relationship. Number three, so why do we eat animals? We eat animals because that's what we learned to do. That's what our parents fed us. That's what our friends eat. That's what our culture does. We live basically in a pastoral culture that raised animals for food. And so it seems very natural and very normal to us. And because these are calorie-dense foods, we like them. We learn to enjoy the taste because they're giving us a huge packet of protein and fat. And so that's why we eat it. The fourth part of the argument, Milton, is I can't justify causing unnecessary pain and suffering to these animals just for my own pleasure. I don't need it for my health. I'm doing it simply because I learned to do it, I learned to enjoy it, and I can't justify it. So I stopped doing it, became a vegan. That's the argument. Can you answer it? He gets very thoughtful. He thinks really hard for about a minute or two, and he looks at his watch and he says, hey, we got to go to the restaurant. We got to go to the restaurant because we're going to be late for the reservation. So on the drive over, I'm driving, and he's very quiet. He's just sort of, take a right at the next slide, and this is before, you had Google telling us where to go everywhere. And we eventually get to the restaurant. We sit down, they pass out the menus, and I think, I can't believe it. Milton Friedman's copping out here. He is not going to answer the argument. He's a chicken. And, but of course, I'm not going to say that. So I was, so we're sitting there reading the menus, and all of a sudden Milton stands up, and he throws his menu down on the table. And he says, Rose, I cannot answer John's argument to my own satisfaction. I have no choice. From this point forward, I am a vegan. That's funny, but what was even funnier was what happened immediately after that. Rose stands up too, and these are little people. They're like 4'11". Rose stands up too, and she throws her menu down on the table. And she says, Milton, don't be ridiculous. We're 92 years old. It's too late for us to become vegans. So I don't know ultimately whether his wife of 71 years won the argument or logic and rationality did. I don't know. He did die a couple of years later of a heart attack, so I think maybe he didn't make the switch. But here's something I do know. There's nobody in this audience that's 92 years old. All of you, most of you are very young. You can have a huge impact. You can lessen animal pain and suffering. You can live a healthier, longer life and avoid diseases. All you have to do is be conscious, eat and live more consciously. Thank you very, very much.
Okay.
Okay, so we want to start off with both acknowledging that our opponents acknowledge that eating meat is actually an important part of the diet. And we're not up here arguing that you should be eating an 100% plant-based diet. However, we are arguing that eating meat in the right amounts, in the right quantities, can actually be very healthy. And I would like to thank our opponents for acknowledging that point along with us and agreeing with us in that statement.
Definitely, and along with that, the idea that vegetarians and vegans are more healthy, we also need to take into consideration that those two populations, especially within the US, are also usually more wealthy, educated, and concerned with their health. So that is a confounding factor in looking at whether or not vegetarian and vegan diets are more healthy.
Yeah, and in addition to that, as John pointed out when he was talking about spinach and how it had more protein than meat, I think that if humans has had enough time, it's actually been shown that we're eating much more prepared foods and eating out more than we used to. If we had the time to actually make all these foods at home, and when we have the option to create meat and produce it at home much quicker than we would creating a salad and creating all these different ingredients, that is something that we need to take into account, the lives of people and the cultures that they live.
Definitely. Another thing that was in the health considerations were a lot of statistics and studies based off of body mass index. And body mass index is a flawed metric because it takes into account weight for height, and some people can have more muscle mass and therefore look like they are more obese. And so those studies don't necessarily draw a perfect correlation. Including some of the photos that John showed were transformations, and those were based on individuals, not studies. And I didn't see any meta-analysis looking at all of the different studies about the vegetarian diets and contrasting and coming to full conclusions. And I'd also like to add, of course, patriarchy would be sloughed off as something to not consider, and cultural relevancy would be something not to consider, because one, y'all are male, and two, so you benefit from that system, and two, cultural relevancy absolutely has to be taken into consideration, especially when we're debating ethics and health of eating meat for global populations. That absolutely needs to be taken into consideration, because it has far-reaching implications for individuals outside of the US.
Yeah, and I would also say that we are not advocating for nothing. We're actually, part of what I was saying is advocating for a different way of growing meat. And I will actually point out that our dining hall does use meat from rotational grazing, which is very similar to silver pastures. It's the same idea. So I'm going to stick up for Bon Appetit on that one. And that killing animals, many people actually have to kill animals and have them on their farm so that they can subsist and that they can be food secure themselves. So to say that we should not do that just to enable these people to grow their own food and have their own nutrition, that to me is unethical as well.
I'm just curious, of those folks, because there were a lot of questions thrown out, how many of y'all grew up on a farm where you did have to kill animals every day? Oh, 2, 3. Okay, yeah, so of course you're not going to be familiar with that and advocate against it because it's not something that was part of your daily practice. Additionally, there was a lot of choice rhetoric in here, and again, that doesn't take into consideration the structural factors that hinders choice and hinders access to certain types of food. And to vindicate individuals based on choice doesn't take into consideration all of the ways in which our society functions.
Yeah, and I just want to close out that saying this debate was all about eating meat, and so when we're diving into topics about being vegan or being vegetarian, that doesn't really address the question of whether or not eating meat is ethical and healthy, right? That was the question that we were posed with. And so while those may be stats say you should eat vegetarian, we want to make sure that we're always focusing on the question at hand, which is about, is eating meat ethical and healthy?
And I would just like to also reiterate that we've talked a lot about animal suffering, and to reiterate, one of my points in my presentation was that you still do cause animal suffering when you eat plant-only diets through crop cultivation, which kills many different species of animals. And to distinguish what type of animal, as Bruce said, we shouldn't be distinguishing what type of animal we value and don't value, and by saying that all your diet when you're a vegan or a vegetarian doesn't cause any harm to animals is, again, incorrect. Thank you.
So I would now like to invite up, first of all, a round of applause. Thank you to all four of the debaters. This was an incredible exploration of a very complicated question. There are no simple answers. No single approach can offer a panacea or a comprehensive exposition on it. And I went through all of the questions. There are too many questions from the audience for our participants to answer, so I've selected just a few to illustrate some of the creative thoughts that you've stimulated this evening. And so I'd like to invite up all of four of our speakers for a quick fire round, quick answer session if we can. So for the for-meat team, you mentioned that this debate only references the views of white people. What does the team say in regards to the ethical problems, in regards to the lack of social justice communities of color face from the negative impacts of animal agriculture? For example, in Hispanic and in Hispanic communities, a lot of slaughterhouse workers are also undocumented workers there. In addition, pig farms in North and South Carolina leave terrible environmental impacts that largely affect communities of color with their pig waste pools. And we're just wondering if you could speak about that.
Totally. So that was a factor taken into consideration when we were talking about, when we were formulating these arguments, and that's why those instances are specifically industrial farms and industrial concentrated animal feeding operations, and that's why we advocated for diversified farming to make sure that those human rights abuses don't happen, because yes, we totally concede that the production of animal agriculture in the industrial ways definitely hurts communities of color. And that is not something that should be taken lightly, and that is why we specifically talked about diversified farming systems.
Great. And for the anti-team, one question: how can you relate increasing weight only with meat-eating diets without taking into account other lifestyle factors such as activity and stress? I believe these are also correlated with weight, perhaps more than meat and vegetarian choices. Any response?
I mean, obviously, it's multifactored. However, it's irrefutable that the people who eat more animal foods are fatter and sicker. I mean, that's what the statistics show. So it's very difficult to prove causality in anything you can't do a controlled experiment in. For example, how many people here believe smoking can cause cancer? Why? There's never been a controlled study proving that. There could be lots of other factors. There's never been a controlled study. It's simply epidemiological evidence. It's no different.
Yeah, just, I don't think we did concede that eating meat can sometimes be healthy, which is healthy, which I think is one of the things you said at the outset. But the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics did a full, they dived in, and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is not a vegan front group, but they have a position paper on vegetarian and vegan diets, and they dived into all of the analysis, and they said not just that vegetarians and vegans are healthy, but that vegetarians and vegans are healthier than people who include meat in their diet. They have lower rates of heart disease, lower rates of cancer, two things that are at epidemic levels in the United States and throughout the West, and also that vegetarians and vegans tend to be at a healthier weight. So there can be a lot of other causes of being overweight, but eating meat is linked with a linear increase that is more than correlation. As far as we can tell, it's also cause.
For the student side, in DRAWDOWN, number 4 solution is a plant-rich diet. Why cite silvopasture, which was number 9, better and highlight that better than a plant-based diet?
So the reason I highlighted that was sort of my argument all the way through, in that we're arguing, is meat ethical and healthy? We're not arguing, are eating plants ethical and healthy? So by arguing for a plant-rich diet, you're not actually answering the question, which is a key thing that we want to make sure we're getting back to, is the question. I agree that eating a plant-rich diet is a great way to reduce carbon emissions. I think that can be very effective. But I think if we're going to go along the side of the question and make sure that we answer that, we want to say that silvopasture is one of the ways where you can work alongside growing those plants with growing those animals and creating a much more efficient ecosystem.
And plant-based or plant-rich specifically, is different than no meat.
Yeah, and I just want to underline that the agricultural economists definitely say that's better. So there are better and worse forms of animal agriculture, but on a calorie of environmental harm, like going to plants, is still going to be better than the best systems that include animal agriculture.
Because there really are we only eat plants or animals. There's not like a third choice. So eating plants is better for your health, better for the environment, better for the animals.
Again.
And I think that's the real question here.
Again, just want to make sure, we're not saying don't eat plants, we're saying that eating meat is possible to be still healthy and ethical, even when you're consuming it in maybe 10%.
But if you have to choose, like if you're either going to eat plants or you're going to eat animals, and if you choose to eat animals, you can eat animals that cause less harm than other animals, or you can eat plants which cause even less harm. Shouldn't you go for the thing that causes even less harm?
And to all of you on this last point, Dr. Quave wonders, in a number of traditional cultures, insects make an important part of the diet as a source of protein and substitute for meat. Should we eat insects instead of meat? Go for it.
Y'all start.
Well, insects are meat, so I wouldn't say insects instead of meat. I mean, if you look at, again, there are people, just like people are proposing variations on animal agriculture, and some of those variations are better or worse than others, and we should certainly go for the things that are less bad. So too insects. If you look at insect farming, you still have to feed the insects. They still take an astronomical amount of energy, actually even more energy than chicken farming, which already requires a lot more energy than legumes. It causes more harm across all of the things that we were just talking about. And then if you dive into insect sentience, that gets incredibly interesting, but also incredibly complex. So, no.
So I think I also think one of the important points here is that this was a point our opponents made, is that, look, ethical perfection is not really possible. They were talking about how if you eat plants that some animals are going to suffer, and that's true. Some animals are going to die when they're harvesting the grains and whatnot, but fewer will die that way than when you're eating animals, because you're growing more grains to feed the animals, and therefore eating meat actually kills more animals in the fields than eating those grains directly yourself. But perfection is not the question here. The question is, how do we live a life of integrity where we minimize our harm? How can we have a greater reverence to life so there's less suffering, not so that we can be morally perfect? And I think that's an important point to make. And I think that's Bruce's point about insects. We can't empathize with insects the same way we can empathize with animals. So it seems less morally objectionable. However, from an environmental standpoint, is possibly even more objectionable.
Last words.
But if you guys want to dig in on the insects, I mean, go ahead.
So I think that we can eat insects, and actually insect-based protein has become more prevalent on the marketplace. So I think that is an alternative that we can definitely explore and should be exploring, but I don't think that it necessarily has to be a replacement for meat whole scale.
Great. No need for.
Again, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I like it.
So,
Hold on one second. If you'd all do me a favor, indulge me for 1 second, would you all go right over there for me? Come right over here, right there.
Wants to turn around?
Yeah, turn around. In fact, just sort of sit on the chair. There you go. Very good. Now, I want everybody up here to please stand up. Everybody stand up. Stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up. Good, 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 good. Just like that. All right. Now, I want everyone to applaud.
Thank you very, very much to all of you. This is indicative of the programming that we're going to be doing in the Food Studies and Ethics program. If any of you are interested, please come talk with me. There are books for sale by many of these authors outside, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you.